Hello and welcome to the fourth module of the Grant Administration and Management Training Series. My name is Lauren Halili. I am the Program Coordinator for the Center for Community Energy and Environmental Justice. And for this module, we are going to be going over procurement standards. And just want to give a little recap on kind of where we are with the Grant Administration and Management Training Series landscape. All three of these modules that you see on the screen here are already available. Those recordings are on our YouTube page at CJ_STSU. And we are currently on our last module of this grouping so far, which is procurement standards. Now, I say last module of the ones that we have outlined so far, but we are working to kind of craft more ideas to have additional modules in the future. So there's still more where this more of this to come. For our learning objectives today, after participating in this training module, participants are going to be able to understand the fundamentals of procurement, navigate uniform grant guidelines for compliance, implement effective internal controls and solicitation procedures, and master the procurement process for federal awards. Okay, now I want to go ahead and introduce the module topic we have for today. Once again, welcome everyone to Module 4 of the Grant Administration and Management Training Series. In this module, we're going to be discussing the essential aspects of procurement for federal funding. We're going to focus on understanding procurement fundamentals, understand how to navigate the uniform grant guidelines, and how to implement effective internal controls and solicitation procedures. Now, I know you all are used to hearing me talk with these modules of this training series, but we're actually going to have Joelle Greenland of CCLR step in. CCLR is the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and Joelle is a senior planning consultant. She has many years of experience with regards to procurement, so it only makes sense for her to offer up her expertise and go through procurement standards with you all today. So without further ado, I want to introduce Joelle Greenland from the Center for Creative Land Recycling.
Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate the introduction and welcome everyone to one of my favorite subjects, procurement. And that might sound a little funny, but hopefully after this module, you'll feel a little bit different about procurement and hopefully understand more about the essential steps of procurement and feel more confident about doing it. So let's just jump in here. So what is procurement? Simply put, it's the process for obtaining products, goods, or services. So at some point in time, when you are using federal awards, state awards, local awards, you're going to have to obtain products, goods, or services with funding. And so that process is called procurement. And in particular, this webinar is about federal awards. So, for example, with EPA brownfield grants, procurement, there's a specific guide for EPA awards, and they've produced two documents. The one on the left is their best practice guide. It's roughly 27 pages, and it can be found on their website and this hyperlink. And it's companion piece for the specific contracting method that is called competitive procurement. And we'll get into the various methods later. But EPA has these two guides. Other federal agencies probably also have other guides themselves to help people through their procurement process. So if you could think about the procurement in general as a decision tree. So for the purposes of this module, federal money, right? Federal funds, if you will. You have to ask yourself first, when you have funds, is it federal or is it non-federal? And if it's yes or no, right? If it's not federal, then you need to refer to any applicable state or local laws and regulations, as well as your own internal policies and procedures. More on that later. If they are federal funds, then how much is being procured? That's your next question. Because the answer to that will determine what method of contract is used, okay? So another thing to consider is, where did the money come from? If it's not directly, you're not the one that actually applied for the grant or is the grantee, right? There is what's called pass-through award, right? So federal funding that is distributed to a recipient through an intermediary, such as a state or local government, right? Okay, but even though it's passed through to you, it's still federal awards, and you still have to abide by regulations, federal regulations, and requirements. Okay, so this is the example. Okay, so federal funds for a community project are given to the state, and then they distribute them to local nonprofits. So although the nonprofits receive the money from the state, it is still federal funding requiring adherence to federal guidelines and regulations, because this is a pass-through award. Okay, so let's just back up a little. One of my favorite things to do with funding or projects as a strategic planner myself, why do it, right? Procurement is a must with federal funding, okay? There are federal requirements contained in the procurement standards of the Uniform Grant Guidance, or UG, published at 2 CFR Part 200, or as we know it as Super Circular, and other rules and regulations, okay? You have to do it. You have to follow UG. It's kind of an appropriate acronym. More on that. Anyway, the other thing is to ensure that purchases are made in a fair and open, competitive way, okay? Free and open competition. There's also cross-cutting federal authorities, such as the National Historic Preservation Act, or the Endangered Species Act, or the Civil Rights Act, right? These are cross-cutting federal authorities, and when you have federal awards, they also apply. And lastly, compliance. Nobody wants to be out of compliance when they're working with federal funding. So think of it in your head when you're doing procurement as the rule of three, right? So if you have federal funding, right, you have to review federal regulations. You have to also review your internal policies and procedures, and you should look at state, if you're a tribe, and local regulations and rules, right? So if you don't have federal funding, then you should still be looking at the two bottom circles. And if it's your own, say, general obligation funds, then you should have, at a minimum, be following your own internal policies and procedures, okay? If you don't have internal policies and procedures, we will be talking about them later on. However, at a minimum, you should have internal policies and procedures. This is just good, sound financial management, and practices, right? So moving on. So federal regulations. I mentioned about 2 CFR 200. So let's talk about them. Federal regulations have the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards. So think of OMB as the White House, right? The executive branch, to provide guidance, right? So the UG, Uniform Grant Guidance, right? The 2 CFR Part 200, or also known as the Super Circular, has these two parts in it. There are other parts, the whole section of 200, but in particular, these two things I wanted to point out. There are procurement standards, specifically at 0.317 through 0.27, and also Part 1500, which specifically deals with full and open competitive requirements, okay? Now, just to give you a little background, why do they call it the Super Circular? Well, years ago, OMB had circulars, right? They would call them A-121, A-80, right? And so each circular that came out had a consecutive number, and there were 7 of them that dealt with administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards to non-federal entities, right? There were a lot, and it was a lot to keep track of. And so in 2011, the government thought, you know what, why don't we bring these all together? And hence the super circular was born. So if you see or you borrow an RFP, let's just say you're doing your own request for proposals and you're going out for procurement and somebody's giving you a copy or you found one, and if you see A-21, 121, 80, if you see an A, there's a very good chance that that is a very outdated RFP because nobody uses those anymore and they're not valid anymore. Okay, so that's just a little tip. So what are the minimum UG standards? These are the 5 minimum UG standards. Okay, so written procurement policies and procedures, I kind of touched on that. That is a minimum. You have to have written policies and procedures prior to procuring those federal funds. Okay, so if you don't have them, you need to first do that, and then you can go out and procure your grant funds, okay, or those federal awards. The next thing is reasonable and necessary costs. Okay, so equipment, let's just say you're procuring for a payloader. They have to be necessary costs, right? So if you just bought one last year, is the payloader really necessary? Okay, and it has to be reasonable. So you can pretty much figure out what reasonableness is as far as if your payloader is 400,000, but if you did a little research and you saw that the typical payloader is 150,000, that wouldn't necessarily be reasonable. Okay, so if you got audited and somebody saw that and you were being audited, they would probably question that purchase. Okay, contract administration system. You have to have internally a contract administration system whereby you are procuring in a manner with contracts that are suitable for the appropriate procurement method, right? And you have to have that in place. How are they developed? How do they get published? Who evaluates them? Who executes them? This is that contract administration system. So you need to have that too. And as you can see, as we're going through these are pretty much common sense. If someone were to give you money, right, they're basically asking you, how are you using my money, and making sure that you have those internal policies and procedures and systems in place to make sure that you have sound financial practices. Okay. So the next one is written standards of conduct. Okay, this is a pretty big section, but things like conflict of interest, right? Both for internal and external conflicts. So standards of conduct also have to be in your policies and procedures. And also there needs to be a cost and price analysis documentation, kind of like that example that I gave you for the payloader. This is that cost price analysis documentation. Does it have to be a dissertation? No, it needs to be written, right? And have an analysis, like your reasoning, just what I said. You know, I talked to a sister city and they said they just bought one and the supply chain has been disrupted because of COVID. Therefore, the payloaders are now 3 times what they were back in 2019. Okay, so you have to have that documentation also in your files. This is all before you go out for procurement. Okay, so make sure you're dating documents as well. Okay, disadvantaged business enterprise, DBE. So we've also heard this, or you might know this as MBE-WEBE, which is Minority Business Enterprises / women business enterprises, or collectively DBE. This is very important. There are 4 things here. Ensuring that there is full and open competition, meaning that organizations must take all necessary affirmative steps to ensure that minority businesses, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms are used when possible. Okay. Various federal awards, right, will tell you that you must make an effort to contract with DBEs. Okay. And so these are these 4 guiding principles, if you will, to help you understand your DBE requirements. Doing also affirmative steps for DBE participation. What does that mean? That means placing DBEs on solicitation lists, ensuring they are solicited whenever they are potential sources, dividing total requirements into smaller tasks or quantities to permit maximum DBE participation, and establishing delivery schedules that encourage their participation, okay? So how do you find DBE, right? How do you find these organizations? Well, you could utilize the services of the Minority Business Development Agency of the Department of Commerce, right, to promote DBE participation. Also contact your local or state small business administration. Find out from others, talk to sister cities, organizations. Hey, what do you do for DBE, affirmative steps? Okay. Requiring prime contractors to follow DBE steps. Now, in procurement, when you are doing an RFP, request for proposal, or even request for qualifications, you could even ask, how are you going to be promoting or ensuring full and open competition with DBE, right, organizations? So you can put it right there in the procurement documents, right? And also when you select that contractor, you're going to also put it in the contract. And I know with EPA grants, they provide in that best practice guide language that you must put into your contracts with your prime contractors. Okay. So DBE is very important. Don't forget about it. My favorite, the procurement claw. So hopefully this image will not burn into your mind, but you remember it as the bear claw. But this is the procurement claw. OMB came up with this image years ago to help people remember the 5 methods of contracting. And here again in the left corner is that EPA brownfield grants for competitively procuring a contractor. This specific document that's being referenced has to deal with number 4, the competitive proposals, which we'll get to. So here we are with the 5 methods of contracting. Number 1, micro purchase. This is when you have or need purchasing supplies or services up to $10,000, okay? And each one of these methods have specific requirements that you need to follow. They become more complex as we go along, except number 5, okay? Small purchases is simple and informal procurement methods for securing services, supplies, or other property that do not cost more than $250,000, okay? These at one time all had different limits. And over the past probably 10 years, I'd say the numbers have fluctuated and changed, right? I can remember micro purchases being $3,000. Now they're up to $10,000. Small purchases are now $250,000. So sealed bids are when you have formal advertising, unlike number 2 that doesn't require formal advertising, with a fixed price contract, okay? This usually is not for technical services, right? You have a fixed price contract, like a bridge that needs to be built. You know that it's like, we have $400,000. This is it. It's a fixed price. People put in their bids. We can do it for $375. We can do it for $350, right? And the lowest responsive and responsible bidder usually gets the award. Okay. Number 4 is the competitive proposals. If you are working with, say, an EPA Brownfields grant, this is most of the time you will be working in the competitive proposals. This is where most of your procurement will be. And that is why there is a companion piece, which was on the slide before, because there are many ways that people can fall into non-compliance because they're not adhering to all the things that you must do under competitive proposals, okay? These are not appropriate for sealed bids. It's a technical proposal, right? It's a cost proposal. And remember that with these, you have to do a formal bid request. You have to have evaluation criteria open for 30 days. So there are a lot of requirements under competitive proposals. So this is one that you really need to be careful with, okay? Non-competitive proposals, or what you might hear of sole source. Sole sourcing is very rare. It is exceptional. And I would say that before you do any type of sole sourcing, that you talk to the agency that has issued your grant and that you're working with, and talk to them before you do any type of sole sourcing proposals. So solicitations. I've been talking about RFPs and mentioned an RFQ, but these two terms, request for proposals and request for qualifications, are very different. So both of them are solicitation methods, right? And you're trying to gain proposals, hence request for proposals, as opposed to request for qualifications, where you're trying to gather information about the qualifications and experience of potential vendors or contractors, right? Typically in a request for proposals, you're going to hire one firm, one contractor, right? And you evaluate still on the criteria such as cost, quality, and approach. And RFQ is still doing that, right? But you are essentially creating a pool or a stable of contractors that you can then work with specifically when you need task orders, okay? I am a fan of the RFQ because it gives you choice. It does have some extra steps in it, but you do have the ability to pick amongst your qualified vendors or contractors. So the main differences are below here. You select a single proposal for a specific project or service. RFQ establishes a pool of qualified vendors for future selection as needs arise. So very important. Cost price analysis requirement, and then cost reasonableness requirement. We talked a little bit about this, but the cost price analysis requirement is a must with federal awards. Before proceeding with a solicitation, organizations, cities, municipalities that grantee must conduct a cost or price analysis. Okay, this ensures that costs are reasonable and justifiable. It involves evaluating the fairness of the proposed pricing and comparing it with market rates to ensure that the organization is getting the best value for the expenditure. Okay. This, if you could think of it as, like, wow, this is kind of a lot, right? I have to do this every time. Think of it as if you were moving, right, to a city that you knew nothing about, how would you know whether you could afford the housing? You would, and if you were to go there, are you getting good value for your money when you go to buy a house, right? So what do? You go to Zillow, you go to realtor.com, you go to Redfin, you go to all these other things, right? You do your research, and then when you go there to either purchase a house or rent an apartment or, just expenses in general, you've done your homework to understand what is reasonable, right? And then you can make a informed decision, which is really what the cost price analysis requirement is making grantees do. Okay, so the cost reasonableness requirement, for both RFPs and RFQs, organizations must ensure and document That is the key. You have to document that the costs are reasonable and justifiable. Okay. So is it a dissertation? No, it's just, you can write it down, you can make an electronic file, but you must document it somehow so that if you ever get audited, it's defensible, right? Okay. So the RFP, conducting cost price analysis to evaluate the proposed pricing, ensuring it is fair and aligned with market rates. And with the RFQ, you still have to do it, assessing the qualifications and experience of vendors and ensuring that any subsequent contracts with selected vendors are cost effective and provide good value. Okay. Free and open competition, good value for the expenditure. Okay. So now you've understood procurement, you've understood the 5 methods of contracting. And so you figured it out, okay, well, I'm going to do an RFP. Now what? Now I've got to build it. And this is where people kind of get a little stuck, like, where do I even start? So these are pretty much some of the categories and the main components that you should think about when building a solicitation, right? Your introduction, what are you needing? Like, right? Why are you even doing this? Always start with your why. Why am I procuring for goods, services, equipment? Like, why? And that will inform your statement of need, your scope of work, which is probably the most important element of building a solicitation. Making sure you have terms, conditions, and expectations. That last one is huge. Make sure that the proposers know what your expectations are, right? Don't wait until the contracting part to really get those out there so that people who are bidding will know whether or not they can meet those expectations. Performance metrics, budget's huge. Some people say, well, I don't want to put the amount in, right? That's completely up to you. The budget, sometimes people will, I think every situation is different. So you'll have to, determine that. Also, your internal policies and procedures may require you to put the budget in. So experience and qualifications, submission requirements, evaluation criteria. This is very, very important. Now, remember, building a solicitation. Do you need to do this for a micro purchase? No. Do you need to do this for small purchases? No. Okay. When you do a formal solicitation, you're talking about the method of a sealed bid, the competitive process, right? Those 2 forms of contracting. All right. So remember, this is building a solicitation when you have over $250,000. Okay. That you're needing services for. So project timetable is huge, right? You want to know, or let them know, this is my time period to get this work done. All right. And legal requirements, you always need to make sure that you have a way to, I call it the ripcord, but to get out of the contract too. If things go awry and you're like, man, I should have done that RFQ. Instead, I did an RFP. So now I have one firm to work with, but now they've lost some key people or they've retired and now the work, is falling behind. You're probably going to have to make some hard choices there. But ultimately, to make sure that the project is moving forward. So you may have to terminate the contract. You may have to, slow down the timetable when deliverables to make sure that the firm can catch up. I think each instance is different. So you just have to evaluate what's best for the situation. And of course, risk management and attachments if you need them. I would say, though, do not attach things like your grant application or all those things are public anyway, but try to really let the contractor be creative with their proposal and tell you the methodology or how they would do it, because then that really allows you to compare apples to apples. Like, wow, this contractor has this whole new method that's more effective and engages the community. If you're really, really prescriptive in what you're asking for, then you're going to get probably very similar proposals back, and it's going to be a little more difficult to do an assessment or an independent evaluation, because they're all going to look very much the same. So that kicks us off to the evaluation part. So evaluation, first review your policies and procedures, right? Make sure you're following them. If they say you have to have an evaluation team of 5 or more, you make sure that your evaluation team has 5 people. You can't have 3 people, right? Form the evaluation team, make sure that they are knowledgeable, unbiased, they don't have any conflicts. I tend to like having a facilitator that is non-voting. This way they can basically facilitate without, they're kind of like Switzerland, right? They're a non-voting person that helps with the evaluation process, selection process, and keeps things moving, but they can be very objective throughout the entire process and stay outside of the voting process. Blind evaluation. Personally, this is key for me, because you don't really want your team talking with one another until you're all together, right? Have each person, right, each member evaluate the proposals individually, and that's what we call a blind evaluation. They score them individually. And then if you want to have in an interview, I find that they're very helpful. Have an interview, have the scores before and after, so that you can compare the interviews separately. Average all these scores together, and you'll find out whether you have a clear winner. Now, make sure that under 2 CFR 200 Part 214, there is debarment and suspension. And here's a hyperlink for that. You have to make sure that anyone that you hire is also, their report card is good with the federal government, if you will. And that's where you would find it in the system for award management, is if your contractor is in good standing. So this is just a scoring example. Your proposals on the left and the various objectives or, criteria. That's what I was trying to say, criteria up top. And clearly you have a winner, proposal number 1, right, with a score of 95. If these scores were very close, you would definitely want to maybe do another interview, or maybe the scores were this before the interview. You definitely at that point want to talk with your team. You want to have a clear winner, okay? If it's a difference by 1 or 2 or 3 points, even 5, I would have a discussion about that. So internal controls. Internal controls are very important. This is fiscal soundness, right? One, we've been talking a lot about this, documentation. Document. This will be your best friend if you ever get audited. It's also a requirement, right? You have a solid team. You know what the why is, you know what the need is, and when they get these proposals, they'll be, in a better position to really evaluate them effectively. Know what the roles and responsibilities are, right? Whether someone is reviewing invoices, whether they are, accepting the proposals, are they the point of contact for the proposals, the questions and answers, training and cross-training. Make sure if one person is going on vacation that somebody else is, a backup. This is all really good stuff. If you have limited capacity, work on some of these a little at a time, but cross-training is probably one of the biggest things that I've seen where succession planning or cross-training hasn't been done. Somebody leaves, and now there's a huge gap in services, knowledge. It's just gone, and now they have to start all over again, right? And worse yet, your grant just kind of goes into, it's stalled, and that's not good, right? So goes hand in hand with succession planning. So if you know that somebody has been there for a while, they're doing a great job, they might be promoted, make sure that you're recording or you're having, you retain that institutional knowledge and making sure that the policies and procedures are in place, that that person is making sure that they're up to date. And then you'll have a solid, not only have a solid team, but you'll have internal controls, which will help a new team to understand what works effectively. Audit requirements. OMB, Office of Management and Budget, governs the standards for audits. Here are the two types of audits, single and program-specific audit. They ensure accountability, transparency, and proper use of federal funds. So they want to know what people are doing with their money, right? So single audit is required for non-federal entities that expend $750,000 or more in federal awards in a fiscal year. And they do a comprehensive examination of the entity's financial statements and federal awards. On the other hand, a program-specific audit, say like community development block grant, that's required if the entity spends $750,000 or more in federal awards and only one federal program. Okay, so you could have a bunch of different federal programs like DOT, Department of Transportation, and Community Development Block Grant, or something under Parks and Rec, right? So depending on what federal program you are receiving money for, this would depend on whether or not you have a program-specific audit. So, and it focuses exclusively on the financial operations and compliance requirements of that single federal program. Okay, so quick updates. It's been a long time, but 2 CFR 200 did have some updates. These are just examples. There's a very comprehensive list, and for more information, there's a hyperlink there. These are only effective for awards on or after October 1st, 2024. Okay, so for example, the threshold for value for equipment and supplies went from 5 to 10,000. So that's a huge one. And removing the prohibition in UGG on using geographic preference requirements, such as the proposer needs to be in the state of Washington or needs to be within the city limits of, right? So read up on these if you think you'll be getting an award on or after 10/1/2024. And lastly, just good old best management practices when you're doing procurement. I've been doing procurement for a while, so it's kind of second nature. It's one of those things where the more you do it, the more comfortable you get with it and you feel confident with it. And then it becomes less painful, if you will. I can assure you that if you ask me about my first procurement process, I definitely had a little head banging on the wall there. But as you keep doing it and as you assist folks, you realize that procurement is very straightforward. If you do the, understanding, right, and follow federal guidelines, you establish clear procurement policies and procedures, you ensure cost reasonableness and perform cost price analysis. You're always promoting fair and open competition, right? You're not having restrictive language in your proposals. You are maintaining robust internal controls, right? Some of the things that we were talking about, the succession planning, right? Knowing your roles and responsibilities, right? You're documenting everything. You're engaging with stakeholders and you communicate clearly, especially with your expectations. You're regularly reviewing and updating your policies, okay? These are not policies and procedures that you put up on a shelf and never to be seen again, right? just like I said, 2 CFR 200 just got updated, right? And so policies and procedures across the country should be looking at those and seeing if they need to modify their own. Okay. Training and capacity building, of course, and monitoring and evaluating your practices. Okay. So I think with all these, you have a really good shot at doing procurement in a manner that will be not only effective, but efficient and, of course, ethical. Thank you so much and happy procurement.
Okay, thank you so much, Joelle, for going over procurement standards with us today. Once again, everyone, as always, if you want to connect with us, here are our website, our phone number, and our email, along with our social media down below, and a QR code if you want to sign up for our mailing list and newsletter. That's a really great way to keep up to date with future webinars, future modules that are going to be coming out, any sort of events, grant updates, things like that. Really highly encourage signing up for our newsletter. In addition, if you have technical assistance needs with regards to procurement or just technical assistance needs in general, you can reach out to us via email or our phone number, or fill out our technical assistance form that's available on our website. So once again, thank you all for joining us for Module 4 of the Grant Administration and Management Training Series on procurement, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.